In this lecture module, let's narrow our focus to consider Paul Churchland's argument in Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes. Churchland begins by articulating that basic idea that folk psychology really consists of categories, that is, mental terms, and mental laws or theories, that is, folk psychological truisms. He then suggests that mental terms get their semantics, their reference, in the context of those categories and laws that constitute what we call a folk psychology. Now, two important and oft overlooked facts about this approach taken by Churchland follow from his adoption of this descriptive semantics. So once you adopt a descriptive semantics, then the eliminative materialism will address the theory directly as a whole and not the individual theoretic terms, since they get their meaning only in relationship to their function within the theory itself. As a result, claims about the non-existence of entities that are ostensibly referred to by those individual terms, that only results indirectly from the elimination of the theory as a whole. Oftentimes you'll find eliminativists talking about a particular theoretic term, pointing to difficulties for that particular term. However, in general, that argument is only intended to bolster the elimination of the entire theory, and hence it only speaks to the elimination of that individual term in that larger context. Thus, we see Churchland begin the article by arguing that one ought really consider mental terms and the folk psychological truisms that they help to express as a theory, folk psychology. Indeed, he tells readers on page 68, such an examination of folk psychology will make little sense, however, unless it is first appreciated that the relevant network of common sense concepts does indeed constitute an empirical theory, with all the functions, virtues, and perils entailed by that status. To further support his contention that folk truisms ought to be construed as a theory, folk psychology, Churchland notes that the average person is able to explain, even predict the behavior of others with a facility and success that is remarkable, and further bolsters the claim by suggesting that many common sense mental truisms can be cast in the same conditional format often used in, for instance, logical empiricism to capture exceptionless universal laws. So, for instance, when we compare 1 here, for all x, F, and M, if x has a mass of m and x suffers a net force of F, then x accelerates at F divided by m. We can compare this, Churchland claims, to the second formulation. For all x and all p, if x fears the p, then x desires that not p. Indeed, Churchland suggests construing our common sense psychological truisms as universal, exceptionless laws in a folk psychology helps us to understand the nature of the claims that we make. When we make claims about the contents of our own minds and about the contents of other people's minds, these are just explanatory hypotheses based on exceptionless universal laws embodied in a theory called folk psychology. In fact, Churchland thinks this argument is so effective that at the bottom of page 71, he tells us, not only is folk psychology a theory, it is so obviously a theory that it must be held as a major mystery why it has taken into the last half of the 20th century for philosophers to realize it. The structural features of folk psychology parallel perfectly those of mathematical physics. The only difference lies in the respective domain of abstract entities they exploit, numbers in the case of physics and propositions in the case of psychology. These arguments that mental terms and truisms constitute an empirical psychological theory proves crucial to Churchland's eliminativist argument. Specifically, by positing a folk psychology, Churchland can subject the collection of ordinary mental terms and truisms to the standards that one uses to evaluate other theories in the context of science. He can likewise construe the ontological issues surrounding folk psychology as involving a choice of how best to treat folk psychology in light of other scientific theories regarding mental phenomenon, like his personal favorite, neuroscience. Perhaps the most important consequence, however, of construing mental terms and mental truisms as an empirical psychological theory is that, as he says on page 69, this approach entails that the semantics of the terms in our familiar mentalistic vocabulary is to be understood in the same manner as the semantics of theoretical terms generally. The meaning of any theoretical term is fixed or constituted by the network of laws in which it figures. Specifically, this means that the reference of our mental terms gets determined by the theoretical relations in our folk truisms. Should this folk psychological theory prove reasonably good, that is mostly true, then mental terms will have reference, just as any other theoretical terms in a successful theory. These references will get fixed via inter-theoretic reduction to more basic concepts and theories within neuroscience. However, if folk psychology proves massively inadequate and false, reduction ceases to be an option, and our ordinary terms are assigned the empty set as their reference, since their mental truisms create a definite description, that is, a Ramsey sentence, that has no true interpretations in the real world. Thus, mental terms will suffer the fate of other definite descriptions with no extension, like people who benefited from the selflessness of Ayn Rand. In short, mental terms will be eliminated from the set of viable categorizations of mental phenomenon. In the next lecture module, we'll consider both the criterion and the verdict that Churchland renders with regard to folk psychology, specifically with regard to folk psychology's viability as an explanatory and predictive model, and particularly its viability in comparison to other competitor theories.